On this episode of 7th Circle Gaming, we analyze a game that frankly I've been very curious about ever since it launched onto Steam, but wasn't entirely comfortable spending the full purchase price on. But when it came up on the Steam Winter Sale, we certainly jumped on it. That aside, the game is called Icarus, and we're going to begin as we always do with a bit of full disclosure, and you're perfectly welcome to read through all of these at your leisure by pausing the video, or don't pause the video and we'll move right on to the screenshots. Now, the first screenshot we have to share with you is meant to be illustrative of what the game world in general looks like. Aside from the overall fairly realistic game world, what we would draw your attention to is the lower 1/4 or 1/5 of the screen, wherein in the lower left hand corner, the hit points gauge, the cold gauge, the oxygenation, the hydration, and the hunger gauge are displayed. These are going to be something that the player is going to be spending a fair amount of attention paying to. Moving right along, the second part of this surprisingly roguelike survival crafting game is the technology tree. This is one of the items that's going to carry over from run to run, and it's also important to note, although it is somewhat subjective, that researching items in the correct order will impact difficulty. Either way, this is what the technology tree is going to look like. Moving right along before we get too overly subjective to the crafting system. A fair amount of the crafting system can actually be completed through by the player themselves without the aid of any sort of crafting bench or additional tools. Moving right along to the talent tree. This is another item that's going to carry over from run to run. And although it doesn't necessarily seem that solo players are going to need to pay as much attention to this as they do the research tree, it is something to be aware of. Now, there are two trees that, as you can see on the screen there, one is rather special to solo play and will add additional bonuses to make the game a little bit less challenging for solo players. And with that aside, we're going to move on to our first chapter proper, which as always is Immersion, which attempts to answer the question of what the game will do to attempt to get players invested into the game world. And the game will be using two methods primarily. These are presentation, in that the game is told through an optional third-person perspective, but is primarily a first-person perspective. The game world is fairly realistic, although we haven't necessarily verified that, for example, gravity is equal to 9.779 meters per second squared. The game will also attempt to use player agency to get players invested into the game world, in the sense that players shape the development and the appearance of their character through various methods and can build structures to their particular preference. Here, the game must earn, for all of these reasons, a 6.5 out of 15. Moving right along to difficulty, here the game must earn a 5.5 out of 15. While the user interface is reasonable and the key bindings are not overly unusual, the single-player mode incurs something of an experience point penalty, which is going to require the player to spend more time with the game before they notice substantial progress. A guide or walkthrough is going to be, or playing through with a seasoned player may prove beneficial if the player is going to play through this on their own, so that they don't research items or unlock technologies in an incorrect order. One thing that we have noticed through all of our evaluation sessions is that the hitboxes could be said to be unusually sized. Now, some might excuse this as being a nod toward the realistic range of motion of the player character, but since this doesn't necessarily apply to every crafting tool, and it does seem to vary by the player stamina level, we can't necessarily agree with that notion. One other thing that we've noticed about the difficulty, or that may impact difficulty, is that player saved games may not reload as expected. In particular, what we are referring to is that if the player neglects to deactivate a camping fire, that they may find that their entire settlement has burned to the ground, because the game assumes that the fire has burned uncontrollably. Although that is something of a subjective statement, so take that with a grain of salt. Moving on to the lasting appeal, here the game has earned a 4.5 out of 15. While the game can be played for particularly long sessions, certainly we've played it for upwards of 3 hours, this was after becoming accustomed to the game's rules and ensuring that we've researched things in the correct order. Beyond that, it does seem that either a long session or multiple short sessions will be required to experience substantial progress of the technology tree. On the other hand, there does not seem to be any downloadable content or mod support at present, although this being an early access game that may come along in the future. Something again for solo players to pay particular attention to is that the game does seem to have an optimal research order, and what's the word we're looking for? We're looking for deviating from that particular optimal research order will seemingly increase the frustration of the player to the point where they choose to create an entirely new character and start over. Now then, with that all said, let's move on to the overall score. Overall, the game has earned a somewhat surprising 7.83 out of 15. Now then, the statements that are going to follow are fairly subjective, so please again have those grains of salt ready. The game wiki may be advisable for players that are playing solo, or again, that having that experienced player handy to answer questions. If the player doesn't have those, it may be the player might find that they require multiple trial runs to comprehend the game's logic. Even after that, the player may find themselves chasing gauges, or you'd also call gauge racing, as they must constantly observe either their hunger, hydration, or cold gauge in an attempt to optimize it. The game does have something, or seems to have something of an optimal research order, and failing to research items in the optimal way will reduce or will produce failure at some point. Now, even once the player has discerned the optimal research order, the game settles into something of a steady pattern that the player must then constantly repeat the same actions in order to progress through the technology tree. However, the game is not unpleasant and can be engaged for hours on end or multiple play sessions without experiencing any sort of frustration or loss of satisfaction. And on that note, let's end the video here and say congratulations. This is the end of the video. We welcome any comments, concerns, or discussions. That's what the comment section is there for. And from 7th Circle Gaming, goodbye and see you on the next one.